understanding the biological processes in the soil is really the key part to working in with soil and building its productivity and creating agricultural systems in a way that harmonise themselves with those biological systems and improve the properties of that soil, so that as you progress your agricultural systems over time, the soil, which is your base resource of productivity, improves in quality and quantity, so that your productivity also improves and increases over time, rather than what typically happens in conventional agriculture, where that productivity declines in health and productivity over time, because the health and productivity of the soil also declines over time. So to understand soil biological systems and how they are interconnected and function in a way that improves the health of the soil really requires an understanding of the roles that the terrestrial components of a particular ecosystem play out, or the aquatic components of that system play out, and how those systems work in with the life that's in the soil to increase the health and productivity and diversity of the soil ecosystems, but also the organic matter and the properties of the soil, which are a result of the health of the terrestrial and soil-based ecosystems. So we'll review some of these functions and look at how they are interconnected and result in the productivity of the system. So the first is really, if we take a kind of a conventional agricultural system where there's a bit of a woodland, there's a bit of a pasture system in there, the trees and perennial plants that are in this woodland develop this deep, diverse root network habitat, which creates an environment where there's a physical habitat around those root zones which can be colonised by soil organisms, and there's a food resource from the exudates that are released from the plants. So exudates are just a fancy name for when a plant releases any sort of nutrient into the soil, such as carbohydrates, fats or proteins, to deliberately feed those soil organisms. And they will deliberately feed them so that the soil organisms will give them nutrients and minerals in exchange for the food that the plants are providing. So it's a two-way commensalistic or mutually beneficial relationship between the plants and the organisms within the soil. Particularly the smaller organisms like bacteria and fungi are the ones that the plants are most interested in developing those beneficial relationships for, because it's the bacteria and the fungi that will mine a lot of the nutrients from the subsoil and the bedrock and break down a lot of the living things, so the manures, the dead animals, and any other sources of organic matter in the soil, break them down and release the nutrients of them and make them available to the plant, in exchange for what the plant's doing, which is photosynthesizing, which is what these soil organisms in the dark can't do. So it's a beneficial relationship there. So that's one part of the equation. It's really maintaining the health of this terrestrial system, and the healthier it is, the better the exudates that the plants will put into the soil. So it's really a diversity of plants which will produce different types of nutrients to that soil organism. So the more diverse and healthy that terrestrial ecosystem is, the more diversity and more abundant the exudates that are going into the soil are, and therefore the more food for the soil organisms, which therefore the more abundant and diverse the soil organisms become. So the first thing you can do, which is really going to improve the overall health of this whole system, is to really create healthy, functional, diverse plant communities within this terrestrial environment. So not overgrazed short grass that's always stressed and never develops any height and any complexity of root systems, but creating a diversity of plants and shrubs and perennial plants and annual grasses and herbs that in combination will feed the soil organisms with a wide diversity of different exudates. The other thing is really habitat and protection from the sun. So if there's a living community here and mulch is produced from that living community, that's going to shade the soil organisms from being damaged by the radiation from the sun, and also provide a food source for the decomposers in the food organisms, food soil, to break down those mulches and to release the organic matter and the nutrients from that into the soil. So soil aggregates are a clumping together of the soil, and the forming of soil aggregates will change the structure and composition of the soil. So a heavy soil with a lot of clay in it, which doesn't allow water to move through it very easily. So quite a heavy compacted soil. As organic matter builds up in that soil and it starts to be formed into aggregates, it's going to loosen and aerate that soil. So instead of being so compacted, it's going to start to be formed into aggregates, and there's going to be more air space, there's going to be more circulation of air and more ability of water to penetrate through that soil layer and to recharge the aquifers and the subwater and to rehydrate that whole landscape. Instead of water just flowing across the surface of that soil, eroding a lot of the surface of that soil and carrying all those sediments into waterways. Instead, water will infiltrate into the soil, be absorbed by the organic matter in the soil, and be stored in that soil for a long-term supply of water to hydrate this whole ecology. So it acts as a battery to store water, as well as increase aeration. The other thing the aggregates do will store the nutrients in the soil, so they will bind and lock up a lot of the nutrients, the minerals that are in the soil, and hold them in those aggregates, so that they're only released when those aggregates are then broken down or decomposed by bacteria and fungi in the soil. And as they're eroded away, they'll release those nutrients back into the soil again. But the formation of the aggregates acts as a way to store those nutrients and minerals in the soil, so that they act as a long-term battery and supply of those to the soil. So formation of aggregates is really one indication of the healthy function of the system, and a way in which the properties of the soil are changed and the availability of nutrients are changed as a byproduct of this. And this really ensures that there's a continuous long supply of fertility within the soil as a consequence of the function of it. Some other things that are going on in the soil is the nitrifying of atmospheric nitrogen. So there's bacteria within the soil that can draw down atmospheric nitrogen and put it into nitrates in the soil. And it's in abundance in the atmosphere, so 70% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but it's only available in small amounts within the soil. So those nitrifying bacteria are able to draw some of that abundant atmospheric nitrogen and store it as nitrates in the soil. And it's a two-way process, so that they can then release that nitrogen back into the atmosphere again. And a lot of plants that are nitrogen fixating plants, so legumes and tree lucernes and gorse and things like alders, they all have a relationship by creating nodules on their roots. And these nodules act as a home for these nitrifying bacteria. And the nitrifying bacteria will live in these nodules and be fed by sugars and proteins and fats by the plant. And in exchange, they will release these nitrates that they produce, and they'll be absorbed by those plants and used as a food source of nitrates for those plants. And they'll also benefit other plants in that area by putting them into the soil. There's also two general types of communities that develop in a soil. One is bacterial dominated, and the other which is fungal dominated. And it recognises the role of those different microorganisms in the soil. So all soil will have both of them in it, but a more grassland dominated system is one where there's a big turnaround of organic matter and decomposition of manures and there's not a lot of woody matter in that system, so there's a lot of soft, greener plant material in that, which can be quite effectively broken down by a diversity of bacteria. So a more pastoral grassland type system tends to be dominated by bacteria, whereas a woodland or a forested system tends to be dominated by fungal microorganisms, because they're the things in nature that can break down the woody matter and break down the lignin in wood to release the nutrients within more cellulose dominated plant material. So you get a dominance of fungus within a woodland or a forested system. And they create big networks, they create big hyphae networks within that system, which can be connected to a diverse range of plants within that woodland and forested system, and exchange nutrients and minerals in that system between different plants and between different fungal systems within that. And what happens when this whole system's working well, whether it's a bacterial dominated system or a fungal dominated system, is that the healthy function of the terrestrial system and all the exudates that are going into this will create a beneficial soil environment where there's lots of beneficial bacteria, lots of beneficial fungal systems in there, and they will outcompete any of the harmful pathogenic fungi and bacteria that would otherwise get in and invade and infect these plants. So as well as getting the minerals and nutrients from these microorganisms in exchange for the exudates, the plants are also creating this community around them of all these beneficial fungal and bacterial microorganisms that will keep out the bad ones that would otherwise infect those plants and cause poor health or kill those plants within those systems.